Good evening. I'm Dr. Brian Clayton, Director of Gonzaga University's Faith and Reason Institute and Associate Professor of Philosophy. On behalf of the Faith and Reason Institute, Whitworth University's Weyerhaeuser Center for Christian Faith and Learning, and the Program Committee, I would like to welcome you to the first public lecture in this, our 5th annual Faith, Film, and Philosophy public lecture series. When I first realized that this is the 5th annual Faith, Film, and Philosophy lecture series, I found myself with conflicting reactions. On the one hand, I said to myself, has it already been 5 years? Where's the time gone? And on the other hand, I found myself thinking, it's only been 5 years? It seems longer than that. And since I'm a philosopher, I turned to analyze these responses, and it occurred to me that my has it already been 5 years reaction is probably due to the fact that I so much enjoy this annual series. I enjoy the topics, the opportunity to hear some very intelligent people talk about film from a philosophical perspective, and the friendship and bonhomie that mark these annual gatherings, or as we would have said in Alabama, the bonhomie. Right? How do you say it in Louisiana? That's about it, right? My other response is, it's only been 5 years. That one probably comes from the sense that I see this series as such an essential part of the mission of the Faith and Reason Institute that it is hard to think of a time when the Institute existed and this series did not. The 3 public lectures this week are part of an initiative that the Faith and Reason Institute and the Weyerhaeuser Center have jointly undertaken to explore the interaction or the intersection of faith, reason, and popular culture. It grows out of our shared conviction that Christian institutions of higher learning must engage popular culture if they are to respond properly to their charge to be places where faith seeks understanding. From the perspective of Gonzaga's Faith and Reason Institute in particular, this series is part of our broader commitment to preserve, develop, and communicate the Catholic intellectual tradition, a tradition that has long concerned itself with the arts. Our series this year is focused on the theme of faith, philosophy, and mystery in film. It is made possible by generous gifts of time, talent, money, and encouragement on the part of many people. Dr. Thane McCullough, president of Gonzaga University, and those in the president's office have provided invaluable financial and logistical support. My counterpart, Dr. Dale Soden, director of the Weyerhaeuser Center, continues to collaborate with me on this project and to provide his good humor and wisdom. The executive board of Gonzaga's Faith and Reason Institute provides direction and encouragement, as does the program committee for this event. And a number of my colleagues in the philosophy department support this project by submitting papers and chairing sessions for the annual national seminar that goes along with this lecture series. And finally, Margaret Rankin, the Institute's program coordinator, attends to all of the details necessary for putting on this event. And my thanks go out to all of them. Among the people to whom I give my thanks is tonight's speaker, Dr. Tkacz, who is a member of the Institute's executive board. She is also, as we say in Alabama, good people. She is a constant source of wisdom and encouragement to me. She is also a top-notch scholar, and we're very fortunate to have her as part of our community and to have her here to speak to us tonight. Dr. Tkacz holds BA and MA degrees in English from the University of Iowa, as well as Master and Doctorate of Medieval Studies degrees from the University of Notre Dame. She has held various prestigious postdoctoral appointments at institutions such as Blackfriars Hall at Oxford University, the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C., and our own Bishop White Seminary. She is the author of several books, including The Key to the Brescia Casket, Topology and the Early Christian Imagination, as well as numerous articles and essays in books and journals. She also gave our own Dr. Michael Tkacz the honor of her hand in marriage, thereby both solidifying our favorable opinion of Dr. Michael Tkacz and also giving rise to the doctor's Tkacz, so well known in certain circles. Tonight she addresses us on the topic, Let Justice Roll Down Like Waters. The mystery is affirmation of justice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Catherine Tkacz.
Thank you. It's a joy to be here. Can you all hear me? I could use this, but I feel like I ought to sing to you or something if I got that. So if I drop my voice, just wave at me and I'll pick up again. Mysteries are enjoyable. The intellectual puzzle of solving the intricate problem, the psychological study of the characters that commit the crimes and those that solve them, these intrigue us. An unusual and striking detective, such as a Sherlock Holmes with his violin, his penchant for disguise, or Lieutenant Columbo with his disarming shabbiness and acute observation, appeal to a wide audience, and filmed versions of their exploits with high production values and settings that are either attractively old-fashioned or luxurious add to their appeal. The sleuth can be a professional detective, such as Niall Marsh's elegant Roderick Alleyne of Scotland Yard, or Patricia Wentworth's Miss Maud Silver, an Edwardian governess who came into a small legacy and set up her own business as a private inquiry agent. Or the detective can be a talented amateur, such as Dorothy L. Sayers' Lord Peter Wimsey or Harriet Vane, or Agatha Christie's elderly Miss Jane Marple from the modest village of St. Mary Mead. The cleverness of the work may include puns hidden in the title. Sometimes these are resolved quickly, as in Niall Marsh's Dyed in the Wool, when a suspicious smell coming from a bale of wool leads to the discovery of the body fairly early on. But in other works, such as Anthony Perkins' film play, The End of Sheila, the pun of the title is like an onion, so layered you don't get to the end of the surprises until the very conclusion of the story. The variety itself captures the imagination. A particular group of mysteries have an additional draw. These are based in justice. In these mysteries, the problem solving and the intriguing details enhance but do not displace the importance of justice within the work. Justice, right order in the society, and within the individual as well. When the drama, whether a novel or a film, concludes with the criminal apprehended and the innocent vindicated, this imparts a particular satisfaction to the audience. It is natural to enjoy justice. This is classic and enduring. Dante shows us this in the Divine Comedy. Even in hell, when Dante the pilgrim sees those who have been malicious to members of their community throughout their lives now being tortured for their crimes that were never repented of, Dante feels a sort of satisfaction in that just recompense. And then, in the Divine Comedy's heaven, he rejoices to see the just shining like the stars, as Daniel had foretold from his vision. In mysteries based on justice, the law is often pertinent, but it is rarely the focus. Instead, more fundamentally, the issue is what is right. To put it in other words, such a mystery is concerned not primarily with the law of the land, but with the law of the Lord, and more basically with how that is lived in the individual person and how living that affects the entire community. Often a theme of the work can be how the just individual obeys the law naturally, while the unjust person violates it inevitably. Put another way, while the plot focuses on justice, in a specific instance involving only a few persons, the implications lead both into very fine details and also into broader meanings. That is, they delve into the well-being and wholeness of the individual, and they also concern the soundness of the community as a whole. This wide spectrum of meanings fits with the fact that reality itself is coherent. That very notion is basic to all theism. The philosophy of theism, of realism, is basic. The one creator God made the universe, and the universe itself is coherent. All human creatures know themselves most truly in relationship to creator and creation. They know themselves as creature made by the creator, and in relationship of themselves with the community as a whole. Indeed, real knowledge of oneself as a creature made by the creator and existing amid other creatures is the basis for the real understanding of justice. For justice concerns all these relationships. Both classical virtue theory among the ancient Greeks and Romans, and also biblical psychology, recognize that justice in its fullness includes right relationship to God, to family, and to community. And this justice is therefore basic to having a balanced and healthy character personally. A classical term for this virtue is pious. That's cognate with English word pious, but nowadays people will tend to dwindle that term down in its meanings and think simply of religious devotion. A person who has great religious devotion is perhaps meek in demeanor. But this is a much smaller set of meanings than traditionally the term had for the classical world and for the Christian world. Two examples help here. Virgil in the Aeneid is most frequently describing the hero Aeneas as pious Aeneas, pious Aeneas. If we think only in terms of a person who has great devotion to the gods, in his case, that seems a rather odd, frequent epithet for the hero of the piece. But the definition of the classical Latin term is faithful to one's moral obligations, dutiful, upright, just. The royal hero Aeneas fought for his country, and when Troy was sacked, he carried his aged father Anchises from the burning city on his back and led his young son Ascanius by the hand from the ruins. Thereafter, his life's work was setting out and developing a whole new nation for his people. And throughout, he often sought the mercy and the guidance of the gods. In his relationship to the gods, to his family, and to his people, he showed proper justice. He was pious. In the Christian hymns, Salve Regina and O Sanctissima, the Virgin Mary is called Piissima, the most pious, because she is exemplary in her proper attitude toward God and all of mankind. A common translation of the adjective in English hymns, when applied to her, is loving. That makes no sense if you think of piety only in terms of having a frequent set of devotions one observes. But if you ground it in the notion of justice, right relationship to God, to family, to community, to mankind, then this makes sense. This full sense of justice informs many of the best mysteries, so that the accounts do more than idly entertain, enjoyable as that can be, but also affirm truths about human nature, dramatically, through what the audience sees happening in the characters. Even if one is reading a novel, one is seeing in the mind's eye. And if one is watching a film or stage production, the seeing is literal as well. The biblical basis for understanding the virtue of justice is a good starting point. By the way, I'll generally be quoting the King James Version of the Bible. Incidentally, this is its 400th year of existence, because that's the version most often quoted by novelists who make allusions to Scripture in reference to justice. The Bible can be considered a user's manual for the human soul. It shows virtue making people good and sin making people bad, causing them to suffer. When Cain has killed Abel, he realizes he will now be hid from the face of God. And this is part of why he declares to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear." He fears he too will be slain. The first murder brings death to the victim, grief to his parents, and self-horror to the criminal. And in general, throughout scriptures, and the Old Testament in particular I'm citing tonight, you find the intention to harm causes self-harm. From Proverbs, whosoever diggeth a pit for another to fall into will fall therein, and he that rolleth a stone to cast it down upon another, it will return upon him. To paraphrase an insight from Ecclesiasticus, the most wicked thing someone can devise for another will recoil upon him, and he won't know what hit him. Justice also involves rewards, and an idiom throughout the Old Testament is that God repays individuals according to the work of their hands. Good works bringing good experiences, foul works bringing foul results. Two mysteries from the Old Testament occur in the context of community, and the just outcome of each legal case in these instances has ramifications for the entire community. These accounts show with clarity the broad meaning of justice. The judgment of Solomon is a familiar event from the Old Testament, when the wise king discerned which of two witnesses was lying and why, and thus was able to save the life of a child and reunite him with his mother. Less familiar is the narrative context for this event. It's the immediate sequel to Solomon's prayer for wisdom. Recently made king, Solomon has established peace in Israel and made sacrifices to God. The Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Ask what I shall give thee." Solomon recalled God's mercy to his father David and the goodness of David's reign, and said that in comparison he was but a little child, faced with the duty to rule the vast multitude of God's people. He prayed, "Give therefore an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad." Pleased, God responded, "Because thou hast asked this thing, and hast not asked for thyself long life, nor riches, nor the life of thine enemies, but hast asked for thyself understanding to discern judgment. Behold, I have done according to thy word. Lo, I have given thee a wise and understanding heart, so that there was none like thee before thee, neither after thee shall arise any like unto thee." At once this wisdom is put to the test. The narrative immediately recounts that two prostitutes came before the king to seek his judgment. They had each borne a male baby and were alone together in the house. During the night, one child died because his mother in her sleep overlaid him. That is, she accidentally suffocated her child. According to the plaintiff before Solomon, then the woman whose baby had died switched babies, so that in the morning the plaintiff awoke with the dead child at her side, but she recognized it was not her son. However, the other woman insisted that the living son was hers. Before the king, each woman claimed the infant was hers. Hearing this, Solomon immediately called for a sword. And they brought a sword before the king. And the king said, "Divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other." Then the child's mother said, "O my lord, give her the living child, and in no wise slay it." But the other said, "Let it be neither mine nor thine, but divide it." Then the king answered and said, "Give the first woman the living child, and in no wise slay it. She is the mother thereof." Significantly, the narrative does not end there. The capping sentence is, "And all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had judged. And they were in awe of the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do judgment." In other words, justice in the individual case affected not only the persons directly involved, but increased the confidence of the community in the justice that would be done, even when it was difficult to discern and accomplish. The biblical history of Susanna is my second example. It has a striking emphasis on justice. Now, in the book of Daniel as a whole, her account parallels in some ways the first vision of Daniel, the vision of the Son of Man coming in glory to judge, a vision Christ himself identified as prophesying his own coming at the Last Judgment. Considered as a mystery, the chapter of the book of Daniel devoted to Susanna provides what was just seen in the Judgment of Solomon, namely the same natural set of references to justice in the individual person, the family, the community, and all of this in relation to God. Susanna's history is also one of 3 rescue narratives in the book of Daniel, which is set during the Babylonian captivity. She, then the 3 young men who were put in the fiery furnace, and then Daniel himself, who was put into the lion's den, are unjustly condemned to death through the manipulation of laws by wicked men. In each case, however, the innocent is divinely delivered. In Susanna's case, this delivery is effected through the law itself. Susanna is initially described with reference to justice. We are told that her parents, because they were just, had her educated according to the law of Moses. Clearly, already we're speaking about justice in the broadest sense. Justice with regard to knowing one's relationship to God and needing an understanding of reality through the study of the religious tradition in order to recognize the relationship between oneself and God. And it's their own just relationship to God and God's people which led them to insist that their daughter would share in this, would also learn this relationship. We are also told that Susanna is lovely, and her husband Joachim is both good and wealthy. On his estate is a walled garden, as private as a house in a room. And it was Susanna's custom to go for daily walks there. The people came to the estate daily so that the 2 elected elders or judges for that year could hear whatever legal cases arose. But the judges, the elders, are hypocrites. The biblical account presents in detail the psychology of sin as seen in the elders. And this psychology has been analyzed exquisitely by Eleanor Stump, the former president of the American Catholic Philosophical Association. A key passage from the account of Daniel is the following. And the old men saw Susanna going into the garden every day and walking, and they were inflamed with lust toward her. And they perverted their own mind and turned away their eyes, that they might not look unto heaven, nor remember just judgments. That first verb, a frequentative form of the verb, is used. Not just a single action, not just once looking, but it makes it so that we can translate this. The old man made a habit of watching her go into the garden. They plot to force her into having sex with them. They hide in the enclosed garden, and when she is alone in it, they rush forward and declare, "No one will see us. Have sex with us, or we will say you came here to meet a lover." Now, this is an implicit death threat. The punishment for adultery under the Mosaic law was death by stoning. Yet Susanna was a woman of courage as well as faith, and she at once refused them, declaring, "It is better for me to fall into your hands than to sin in the sight of God." As Eleanor Stump observed, she turns on the instant to the morally heroic choice. She will put her life on the line to avoid collaborating with moral evil. In this choice, she exemplifies the special excellence of intellect and will that Aquinas calls wisdom. Susanna then screams, a very practical action, which prevents the elders from attacking her. But when the servants arrive, the elders execute their threat and falsely charge her with adultery. Now, Mosaic law required 2 witnesses to give a legally acceptable interpretation. And in Susanna's case, she had 2 false witnesses against her, whereas she herself had no second corroborating witness. She is condemned to death, But she prays, and the narrator recounts that immediately the Lord heard her. He inspires the Holy Spirit within the boy Daniel, who halts the procession that is taking Susanna to execution. The people recognize the presence of the Holy Spirit, follow Daniel, return to judgment with him as the judge. He separates the elders, cross-examines them. Their contradictory answers make it clear that they have perjured themselves. They reveal their falseness, and Susanna is revealed as innocent. In the Mosaic Law, the law of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, refers to the punishment for perjury. Whatever the innocent person would have suffered if the one giving false testimony had prevailed, that is the punishment the perjurer himself is to suffer. The narrative of Susanna thus continues, "And the assembly rose up against the elders, for Daniel had convicted them of false witness by their own mouth. And to fulfill the law of Moses, they did to them as they had maliciously dealt with their neighbor, and they put them to death." The narrative continues, "And innocent blood was saved in that day. Susanna's parents, with Joachim her husband, and all her kindred, praised God for Susanna, because there was no dishonesty found in her." Instead of the hypocritical and vicious elders subverting the community, now it is Daniel who has become great in the sight of the people from that day. So the community had been restored to having a just judge. Moreover, in the book of Daniel as a whole, the implications of this narrative are highly significant. Susanna has demonstrated heroic faith. She is the first of the three rescue narratives. Hers is the first of the three. She set the model that was imitated by the three youths in the furnace and by Daniel himself, to heroically hold to the faith at the risk of one's own life. And in each case, the benefits to the community are great. In the judgment of Solomon and the history of Susanna, then, the full scope of justice is in play. Not only is a just outcome achieved in a legal case, but the innocent individuals are vindicated and the community benefits as well. Indeed, 4 traits may be identified in these 2 biblical narratives. The judge is good, psychologically healthy and perceptive, in right relationship to God. The innocent is vindicated, the wicked is punished fittingly, and the community is strengthened. Fictional mysteries which share this grounding in the full sense of justice are particularly satisfying. They speak to the fullness of our human nature. Christian anthropology recognizes that each human person is made in the image of God, and so is a creature, and yet a creature blessed with a likeness to God, morally competent, and so able to be just and good in imitation of God, who is perfectly just and good. Living in human society, both the family and the larger community, and flourishing best when the family and the larger community are themselves directed by justice and goodness. Several works of fiction, including notable mysteries, draw on this understanding of human nature. And the focus now will be on murder mysteries by Agatha Christie with references to works by Chesterton, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Patricia Wentworth, and some others. These writers are all English. It's worth noting that other cultures also produced justice-based mysteries. Though time precludes dwelling on that, it's worth noting the prominence of justice in the cases of the Chinese detective Judge Dee, who lived in the 7th century in China. A provincial judge, he was responsible for ensuring justice among his people, and to that end, he solved many crimes ingeniously. A Dutch ambassador to Japan, Robert van Gulik, translated some of the medieval accounts of Judge Dee into English, and thereafter wrote numerous fictional narratives that are like the actual accounts, continuing the focus on justice in the role of Judge Dee. One of these mysteries was made into a film in 1974 as Judge Dee and the Monastery Murder. A fine film, though not available commercially, alas. The script was by Nicholas Meyer, of course, author of other mystery film scripts, and Kai Dee, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, portrayed Judge Dee. G.K. Chesterton's 52 Father Brown stories are excellent accounts, clever and engaging and psychologically astute and grounded in the full sense of justice. Moreover, as a priest, Father Brown has the clear concern for the repentance and reformation of criminals. Notably, the arch thief, the famous Flambeau that Chesterton invents. In the course of the series of narratives that he writes about Father Brown, comes to repentance and reforms his life. In 1974, Kenneth More starred in a series which filmed 13 of the Father Brown cases. Many excellent mystery novels have some of the four features mentioned, but not all. In recent decades, rather than a thoroughly good judge or detective, novels often feature a damaged detective, such as P.D. James' Adam Dalgleish of Scotland Yard. Perhaps the most appealing of these, not terribly damaged but somewhat, is Dorothy Sayers' Lord Peter Wimsey, who was shell-shocked in the war and always suffers when a criminal he has identified is convicted. For some of these psychologically wounded detectives, the best they and the community can achieve is a postmodern melancholy. There's no flourishing that seems possible in some of the narratives. That's seen in the British series focused on, I think, Inspector Morse and Inspector Lewis. In other works, an amateur detective arrogantly assumes the role of judge and judges wrongly. In Josephine Tay's Miss Pym Disposes, the title figure discovers that an apparent accident was murder. However, she takes it upon herself to destroy evidence of the crime because she thinks she's identified the killer and enjoined her to penance, accomplishing justice mercifully, and she's very pleased with herself. Only at the end does she realize that someone else had committed the murder and is going merrily on her way because the evidence has been destroyed. The same, I think, seems to be the case in the recent novel, The Tuesday Philosophy Club. Other mysteries are excellent as books, but recent productions of them as films have co-opted the stories to advocate for the production company's preferences, which sometimes contradict the author's original intentions, and mitigate the presentation of justice. If memory serves, this was true of the films of Niall Marsh's mysteries featuring Roderick Allen. Certainly the later seasons of the Sherlock Holmes series with Jeremy Brett sometimes made him psychologically weak in ways that go beyond Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's accounts. In one film, when he's hiding in a shrubbery at night to be at hand to prevent a crime, a buxom village girl comes to him and asks him to kiss her, and he whimpers in reply that he doesn't know how. This is not from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This is something injected for the interests of the people making the production. Several of the later David Suchet, Poirot films are heavy-handed in anti-capitalism. For instance, Dead Man's Mirror, and especially The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. In the latter, even the guilt of the murder seems mitigated by the fact that the victim was, after all, a capitalist. The new BBC series of Agatha Christie's Miss Marple, with Geraldine McEwen, introduces lesbian characters to the mystery of the body in the library and omits several characters from Sleeping Murder, replacing them with entirely different ones. This seems to be using the names of Christie and Marple mainly as packaging to ensure an audience. However, to exemplify the justice-based mystery, Agatha Christie makes a congenial subject, for she deftly and often wittily drew on both classical and biblical references, often in conjunction with each other, and sometimes in connection with justice. And that will be the example I'll focus on more fully in a moment. In one novel, for instance, a flamboyant Russian creates a successful London nightclub called Hell, the entrance guarded by a tame but massive dog named Cerberus. A series of cases solved by her famous detective Hercule Poirot appeared under the title The Labors of Hercules, in which each case had a playful resemblance to one of the 12 heroic labors of the mythical strongman of ancient Greece. Yet of her major detectives, Christie's Miss Marple is more effective as a spokesman for justice than Poirot. For Poirot, only rarely, sometimes takes justice into his own hands. In Murder on the Orient Express, written in '34 and perhaps known to many of you through the elegant 1974 production by Sidney Lumet, Hercule Poirot solves the crime but deliberately allows the murder to go unpunished. Christie prepares for this by having Poirot initially, on first seeing the person who will be the victim in the novel, find the individual appalling. It is, quote, as though a wild animal, an animal savage, but savage, you understand, had passed me, he remarks, adding that he senses evil, quite a strong word. The ingenious puzzle of whodunit makes the novel engaging, and the implicit exoneration of the crime of the murder that takes place on the Orient Express is that it avenges an earlier crime committed by the murdered man Ratchet. He had kidnapped and murdered a child, which led in turn to 5 other deaths: that of her mother and prematurely born sibling, the suicide of her multiply bereaved father, the suicide of a wrongly suspected maid, and the death from grief of that maid's mother. Poirot, only in the film, opens his explanation at the end to the assembled passengers by asserting, "A repulsive murderer has been repulsively and perhaps deservedly murdered." Nevertheless, the murder on the famed and luxurious European train was undertaken entirely from vengeance, not to prevent additional murders. As a different Christie sleuth, Miss Jane Marple, observes in a different novel, one must reject the idea that a noble reason justifies murder. One must not countenance, quote, any silly ideas about nobility when only evil exists. Poirot's motive is different in the novel Curtain, the final case of his career. The detective identifies a secretly vicious person, X, who repeatedly and insidiously foments murder by others, and will continue to do so, evidently, as long as he is alive. Poirot considers that man's death essential to protect other potential victims. In this case, Poirot condones murder. At the same time, he recognizes that the one who murders X is nonetheless a criminal, and so Poirot ensures proper punishment of the person who kills the villain, and yet Poirot did condone murder. Miss Marple would not have handled either case, as Poirot does. Miss Marple has a natural flair for justice. Unlike Poirot, who is by profession a policeman and thereafter formally a detective, Miss Marple simply encounters crimes and is drawn to assist in their investigation. Elderly and unprepossessing, easily dismissed socially, she observes acutely, with kindness, but with a ruthlessness that will not flinch from the truth. The novel Nemesis, written in 1971, is an excellent example of a mystery grounded in justice, and neatly using both classical and biblical references to emphasize this. The narrative of the book opens as Miss Marple reads the obituary of someone she had met years earlier in the Caribbean. Mr. Jason Raphael was a wealthy financier, pushy, in ill health, and inclined to scoff at the conventional elderly Miss Marple. She describes herself to herself as a fluffy old girl and an old tabby. However, in the Caribbean, her insight into a death that occurred at the resort they were each staying at commanded Raphael's respect to such a degree that he followed her directions and thus helped prevent a second murder. In the novel Nemesis, Miss Marple recollects this while musing after learning of his death and finds herself aghast at an idea that had come into her mind. There can't be a bond of ruthlessness between us. Do you know, said Miss Marple to herself, it's extraordinary. I never thought about it before. I believe, you know, I could be ruthless. Her maid objects. You are kindness itself. All the same, said Miss Marple, I believe I could be ruthless if there was due cause. Well, what would you call due cause? In the cause of justice. And the maid bears this out by recalling that she had seen Miss Marple lay into little Gary Hopkins when she caught the boy torturing his cat. Miss Marple continues to consider this aspect of herself, thinking back to the events in the Caribbean. It had not been anger she had felt. It had been an insistence on something that was absolutely imperative to put in hand at once in order to prevent a second murder. Her purpose, she saw, had been to protect the innocent and to thwart evil. In the Caribbean, Jason Raphael, for this reason, had called her Nemesis, the Greek mythological goddess of retribution. The film version with Miss Joan Hickson, made in 1987, usefully clarifies that classical reference at the start of the film and doesn't assume that the audience will all recognize who Nemesis is, or that Nemesis is a who and not a where or a what. Its opening scene shows the now very ill Raphael, chair-bound, and in a husky, gasping voice that emphasizes his words, saying, "Thousands of years ago, Nemesis had a measuring rod, a chariot, and a weapon they called a scourge. Last time I saw her, she was walking about in a pink woolly shawl." Soon after reading Raphael's obituary, Miss Marple receives a letter he had written shortly before his death, to be sent to her after he had died. He asserts, "You have a natural flair for justice, a natural genius for investigation, and that has led to your having a natural flair for crime." He asks her to undertake an undefined commission. He is sort of tantalizing her, wanting to ensure that she will take this up. He explains only that it is to serve the cause of justice. And he concludes with verses from the Old Testament from the prophet Amos. "Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Miss Marple understands that Raphael wants her to serve the law, or justice with a capital J. She is either to set right an injustice or to avenge evil by bringing it to justice. Gradually, pieces of the problem are assembled. Raphael's only son, Michael, was believed to have murdered a young woman 10 years earlier. Without question, Michael was a bad character, with a police record for assault and forgery, and paying paternity support to 2 women. The book and the movie differ in how they present the problem, but the moral point is the same in both. In the book, Michael has been sentenced to life imprisonment, but the prison warden and the criminal psychologist believe he did not commit the murder. In the movie, Michael had never come to trial, but his reputation had been ruined because he is commonly believed to have gotten away with murder. In each version, however, Miss Marple knows she is to solve the case and either, in the book, verify or overturn the conviction of Michael, or in the movie, finally get the evidence to bring to trial Michael himself, or someone else if someone else is guilty. Michael and the young woman who was murdered had been secretly engaged. Miss Marple learns from the criminal psychologist, Professor Wanstead, that Jason Raphael had been quite clear that if his son was indeed innocent of the crime, I want to get him vindicated. I want justice for Michael. In both the film version and the original book, the issue is, what is the truth? And Christie points this up subtly by a pun she never presses. Simply the fact that the young woman who was murdered is named Verity Hunt. Miss Marple realizes that if Michael is innocent, then the actual murder remains unsuspected, and seeking that person's identity may be dangerous, and indeed a new death occurs. Perhaps a new murder. It's not clear at first. Miss Elizabeth Temple, the former teacher of Verity, dies when en route herself to find out what had happened at the end of the young woman's life. When dying, Miss Temple asks Miss Marple to find out who killed Verity, and Miss Marple replies, "With God's help, I will." Verity had been an orphan, the ward of three sisters, Lavinia, Clotilde, and Anthea Bradbury Scott. Miss Marple finds, when she first meets them, that Clotilde, who was the closest to the young woman, has an aura of grief, even 10 years after the death. As her acquaintance with the household continues, she more clearly senses there an atmosphere of evil, of danger, of great unhappiness, of fear. The unhappiness is almost frightening. But does this stem from grief over their murdered ward, from remorse by one of the sisters, or from something else? Also in the mix is a kind of struggling different atmosphere, an atmosphere of normality. That normalcy she finally is able to attribute to Lavinia, who has no suspicion that one of her sisters had committed murder. But which sister? Clotilde implicates to Miss Marple Anthea as hateful, jealous, even capable of attacking someone. Indeed, she suggests obliquely that perhaps Anthea killed Verity. Recognizing that no evidence exists to prove the criminal's guilt in the prior murder, Miss Marple lures the murderess into an attempt to kill her. Over dinner, Miss Marple gives hints to all three sisters that she knows now who really killed Verity, with no intimation that it may be one of them. She is holding to her strong suit of being a genial, if fluffy, old lady. It seems mere pleasant conversation when she adds that she longs to see the white flowers in bloom tomorrow at the mound over the fallen greenhouse. In the middle of the night, Clotilde enters Miss Marple's room to finish her off, but finds her alert, for Miss Marple had not drunk the hot milk Clotilde had prepared for her at bedtime, laced with severe sedative. Intending still to kill Miss Marple, but willing to talk first, Clotilde asks, "Who are you?" and receives the answer, "One of my names is Nemesis." "Do you know at all, can you imagine," Clotilde says, "how I have suffered?" Miss Marple answers simply, "Yes, I can imagine it." She has figured out that Verity was not the only victim. Clotilde had also murdered Nora Brent, a promiscuous girl in the village, disfigured Nora's face, hid her body where it would not be found for several months, and then, as Verity's guardian, Clotilde had falsely identified Nora's body as that of Verity. The two ghastly reasons for this were so that Clotilde could secretly bury Verity's body in the fallen greenhouse and thus keep the obsessively loved ward nearby. Clotilde had planted white flowers over this unacknowledged grave. The second reason was to mislead the police into thinking that the other girl's body was that of Verity, so that Michael Raphael would be tried for murdering his fiancée. Christie elsewhere, in two other novels, Murder in Retrospect and Sleeping Murder, both of which have been filmed, presents a murderer who kills to keep a beloved from leaving, and at the same time frames the beloved's spouse out of obsessive jealousy. When Miss Marple discloses her knowledge to Clotilde, the murderess menaces the elderly woman, who firmly replies, "I'm old, and I have very little strength left in my arms or my legs, very little strength anywhere, but I am in my own way an emissary of justice." When Clotilde moves forward to kill, 2 bodyguards emerge from hiding and protect Miss Marple. Later, when Michael has been officially exonerated, Miss Marple is discussing the case with the governor of the prison and the assistant commissioner of Scotland Yard. She discloses that Clotilde had not only killed 2 young women years earlier and killed Elizabeth Temple, but had been preparing false clues to frame her sister Anthea for these murders. Miss Marple's diagnosis of Clotilde is astute. After she committed the first murder, then, having accepted evil, done evil, surrendered to evil, she had no qualms about what she would do next. Notice how this makes Clotilde like the depraved elders who sought Susanna's death. Clotilde even began to enjoy planning more murders. Yet she brought upon herself great agony. She had kept the girl's body in the garden and unwittingly subjected herself to passionate longing for the girl to be alive again. Miss Marple says, I don't think she ever suffered from remorse. I don't think she even had that consolation. She just suffered, went on suffering, year after year. Christie gives her detective a striking way of putting it. Clotilde suffered sorrow, misery, fear, and a growing cultivation and imbibing of evil. Clotilde's secret guilt produced harm to her sisters and community through the unsolved crime. After all, for 10 years, Anthea had lived with the horror of suspecting her sister's hidden guilt. Miss Marple suggests that Anthea suspected that the truth came to her little by little, and this frightened and disturbed Anthea and threatened her mental health. The family of the other woman Clotilde had murdered had for 10 years not known what had happened to her. The film version dramatizes this poignantly in an added scene with that woman's mother. Elizabeth Temple's life was cut off prematurely, and Michael had been imprisoned and wrongly thought to be a murderer for 10 years. Miss Marple's solution of the crime begins the possibility of healing for Anthea, freedom for Michael, and at least knowledge of her daughter's end to Nora Brent's mother. In sum, Agatha Christie's nemesis provides in Miss Jane Marple a detective who is a good and wholesome person, achieves the vindication of the innocent, brings about fitting punishment for the criminal, and prepares for restoration within the community. It is a mystery grounded in justice in the broadest sense. The final scene of the book is Miss Marple's interview with Michael, soon to be released from prison and rather dazed. It's fitting tonight to let Miss Marple have the last word. She tells Michael Raphael, "Your father, when he was a dying man, determined to see that you got justice. Your father thought justice was important. He was, I think, a very just man himself. In the letter he wrote me, asking me to undertake this proposition, he directed me to a quotation. 'Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream.'" Oh, what's it mean? Shakespeare? No, the Bible. One has to think about it. I had to.
We have time for some questions.
Yes, Richard.
I did not know that Miss Marple had ever been cast as Nemesis, so this is pleasure to hear this account. Now, Nemesis it's true, is an agent in Greek mythology, but Nemesis is also an event. And the usual pattern in the ancient Greek culture was that Nemesis is preceded by hubris, overweening pride. And that Nemesis is followed by ate, which is disaster, catastrophe. And this repeats over and over and over again, for example, in the ancient playwrights, and to a certain extent in Homer as well. So I'm wondering, how Agatha Christie's casting of Miss Marple as Nemesis, how much of the Greek pattern has she actually borrowed, and how much of it has she changed?
Rather than seeing this as allegory, if you will, with Miss Marple equating in full detail with Nemesis, this is like Christie's rather figurative use of allusions, where she'll use an allusion for part of the nuance and not necessarily want you to do a great deal with it. The fact that she has Raphael refer to Nemesis as, I'm sorry, that's the film version, we can't ascribe that to Christie. But Raphael refers to her as Nemesis as a person, so not as an event, but a person, and is contrasting the frightening character from Greek mythology with this dithery old lady with the fluffy pink shawl. So Christie is not invoking the event. The reference to hubris, I think, fits. In each of the cases where Raphael considers her Nemesis, both in the Caribbean, and then it turns out, although Raphael couldn't have known this, but it turns out that with Clotilde as well, the murderers are people who have hubris, who have an arrogance and a scorn for other people and willingness to use them. So I think that fits, the element of hubris does, but not the notion that the full Greek resonance is meant to be taken in detail.
Yes, well, that causes me to ask a second question then. Do we then see in just that point that we have arrogant pride in killers, and we have this figure of Nemesis who brings about justice? It's the ate, it's the disaster, which, again, the ancient Greeks is usually spread throughout the community, or throughout the tribe, or throughout the family, that is conspicuously missing from the Greek paradigm. So I'm wondering if that isn't the point at which Christie's own understanding of the Christian and Jewish tradition has come into play.
I think that's a very good point, because in fact she's correlating directly Nemesis and the quotation from Amos. They're both in the letter from Jason Raphael. They're both in the same written text. So she's clearly modifying the notion. Well, the image of Nemesis is subordinate to the notion of justice she's getting from the prophet Amos. If we take Amos in context, that's not going to be a happy time Amos is talking about. I mean, there's punitive stuff that's on the way. And in fact, while I pointed to the restoration that Miss Marple's revelations make possible, the immediate aftermath has to be more shock and horror, as you see in the film version. And that's true for the initial one, where Raphael calls her Nemesis. In A Caribbean Mystery, when people realize who the murderer is, this is horrifying for people. But the conditioning of the Christian affirmation of the possibility of restoration is not determinative here. That's stronger than the idea of retribution that's only horrible. Yes, Charles.
As I recall, justice for Judge D meant restoring balance. The crime had caused the balance in the society to be offended against, and his judgment was to restore the balance. And I wonder if that has relevance here, whether that notion of restoring the balance might cast some light on some of the choices made by the detectives that you spoke about in the course of your remarks. Particularly as when you were talking about the murder on the Orient Express, the fellow who's eventually killed is really, the crimes that he's committed have had terrible consequences. So in Judge D's terms, the society has been thrown way out of balance. And so that would almost justify really sort of radical action on the part of others you know, to restore the balance. So I just wondered what this notion of balance had any relevance, you do think, of this with the idea of justice.
And as you were describing, that you were talking about the effect on the people damaged by the crimes of Ratchet, the victim in Murder on the Orient Express. But readily Anthea comes to mind because she is psychologically unbalanced by what has happened. The degree to which she is disturbed is exaggerated by her, by the murderess, Clotilde, who was wanting to frame her for murder and so wants people to think she is unbalanced. But she is off-kilter. She's thrown by what she can't quite bear to see. There's a sense in which she has to see it and get beyond it before she can regain a right balance. And as long as there is a deceitful covering up of murder, that's not going to be possible for her. Murder on the Orient Express comes very close. You used the word almost, and I think that's perfectly put. The murder there is almost justified. And there are a couple of hints in the, but they're very slight. There's not a lot of discussion of the rightness of killing the man. In the novel by Christie, repeatedly people react to him as if he's an animal. There's something feral and malevolent about him. By the end of the novel, you know, all these people already know that he was a murderer. So that, in retrospect, conditions how we interpret what they were saying. Poirot makes a point, but it's only a single statement in the novel, that Ratchet had apparently been committing crimes using the same method of kidnapping a child and then murdering the child and taking the ransom and escaping, so that there would have been at least 2 other children he had killed in that way. And at one point it said that he was brought to trial but got off through a technical inaccuracy, and that had he not been able to use his wealth to escape, he would have been lynched. So you have this great sense that society recognizes what an evil he is within it. Certainly all the people involved in the murder consider themselves justified. And so there's a sense in which this is restoring balance. You get that sense more strongly in the film version, partly because Richard Rodney, what's his last name? Benton? His score is so light and delightful. It's not a, this is dire stuff happening here. And it ends very light and happy. And that implies that what has happened is good. But you also see some of the people involved in the crime suffering, leaving it ambiguous. Are they suffering because of what they have done, or because what they have experienced? So in seeking to regain balance, if one goes outside legal justice, one risks unbalancing oneself also.
But surely you could go further than that. And surely Christie goes further than that. The killing of this man on the Orient Express is justified because he's going to escape the claims of justice. He's already escaped them by getting off and through the technical problems of the trial, and because of his wealth and so on. And isn't this one of the things that motivates the multiple ages that their understanding, which it turns out is correct, is that this man is going to escape punishment unless they do something.
And what they do is certainly clever, ingenious, and effective. And yet, think of Hamlet. Think of that pivotal chapel scene. Hamlet is determined to avenge his father's murder by killing the murderer, and he withholds his hand from doing it when he thinks the man is in a state of grace. Up sword, and know thou a more horrid hint. Kill him when you can damn him. Murder on the Orient Express, drugs a man and kills him. Doesn't let him know it's going to happen. No execution, and this is Judge D as well, happens in that way. A just execution notifies the person what's coming, giving a last chance for repentance and reformation in this life. And that's what's missing. How could you devise something that could be done in that way in which the people doing this would be safe? Because that was a major concern. They wanted to do this with complete safety and anonymity and no effect upon their own reputations or lives. I don't know. I don't know if they tried to. I don't think they tried to, and that's the Hamlet error.
I'm wondering, you very nicely sketched a continuity between the Susanna story and I'm actually putting them out of order here.
That's
the
okay.
Susanna story and murder mysteries like Christie, and then the Amos phrase. And I wonder, however, if there's an important difference that really shapes the way we think about justice here. Let me just try to sketch it out. In the Susanna story, I bet you're not going to like this characterization, but let me try it anyway. In the Susanna story, we have a naive picture of what the restoration of wrong can amount to. As you said, there's a celebration, there's a sense that all is well, but of course, the community is still fractured. We have these evil elders who have acted in this way, who have damaged, and the rippling effects of their action and of their bad character, they're still present in germinal form in the community, it would seem to me. So there's a naive picture of the restoration here. If we go to Amos, it seems to me what we have is an eschatological, I can't talk here, eschatological picture of complete restoration, where God is at work and we have justice flowing down. We have almost that picture of, you think of I forget which psalm it is, of the overflow, right? That complete overflow of divine perfection and justice and making things right. But what we have in the middle, then we have something very different in the middle. We always have justice that is partial and incomplete. And when there's a restoration, it's always a restoration that is the best we can do. And I think the reason I want to bring this out, because I think it shapes the way we think about murder narrative, or even more broadly, mystery narrative, that there's always an implicit theme of human brokenness and sinfulness, and the fact that we look ahead to the eschaton, we look ahead to that moment when justice does flow down like water, but we know that in this place, in this now, the best we can do is find a way to, like you said in the character of Clotilde, this whole family is shattered by this series of events. And yes, it's true, Miss Marple solves the mystery and the right person is punished, but the ripple effects of this evil cannot be erased, or even, you want to say that justice makes right the wrong, even if we go back to you, Charlie, your point about balance, but there is no balance short of the ultimate righting of all wrongs by God himself at the end of time. I'm just curious what you think of that way of looking at these. We have the similarities that you pointed out. What about these differences between the three?
The first thing that comes to mind is an image of someone. We're going to use the person as the representative of the body of the community. say with a terrible infection in the arm, and the physician lances it.
Right.
Out comes the infection. The relief is enormous. And this can be the beginning of healing. But there's a long way to go, and there's still injury, and there's still imbalance, because this is an arm that's been out of commission for a while. Even how to use the arm. If this has been really bad for a long time, this one's been doing all the work, and this one's, the whole body is out of balance. But that doesn't. So I think that the restoration of order is the beginning of healing. That's why I used that phrase at the end with Miss Marple, I think, by what she did, created the beginning of restoration. But there's a long way to go. I would disagree with the characterization of the justice in the account of Susanna as naive, partly because if you really take the structure of the book of Daniel as a whole, this is normative for purifying the community in captivity, and it's the basis. Backing up some. In the original book of Daniel, the pre-Christian one, the account of Susanna was chapter 1, when Daniel's a boy. And that's what it is in the Greek, and that's what our very earliest commentary on the entire book of Daniel does. It places Susanna's account first. And after that, that's when you have all the heroism of the individuals of the Jews in captivity. They're following. Susanna is heroic within the Jewish community. All the other heroic acts take place in the context of relations with the captors. It's by straightening out the community that it's possible then for other members of the community to go on and be witnesses outside the community. So I think that is evidence for a restoration of community. The fact that the elders themselves are dead now, it does not eliminate their past influences upon the community and the strands of that. But I don't think that was implied. I think that the statements at the end of that chapter are right. Innocent blood was saved. Wicked would-be murderers have been executed, and the people recognize who's a good judge. Their world's better off than they were at the start. But you had a lot of thoughts in what you said. Have I responded to?
Yeah, that's helpful.
Okay.
Last question. Please.
Well, maybe I'll just ask a question. It strikes me when we think about the Susanna story, or the Daniel story, or the story in Solomon, we know who the bad person or persons are from the start. We know who the good persons are. We know who's just and who's unjust. And the story is really about, we're asking the question, okay, how is God going to solve this problem now, to make sure that justice prevails? Or how is the human judge going? How is Solomon going to get out of this? How is Daniel going to rescue himself in this one? How is God going to rescue Daniel from all these things? Whereas in the mystery, the just and the unjust person has not yet been identified. And I'm just wondering if you have any thought. I mean, why do we find it so interesting to identify that bad person? Why does that seem so crucial to us? And if that's really the case, I mean, I wonder if Hercule Poirot's what's done in Murder on the Orient Express isn't enough. The bad person's identified, the unjust we know, and so there's something that's sufficiently satisfying to us about that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the genre is different. In the biblical narratives, God's action in history is being demonstrated to us. And everything has already happened that is being recounted. So the character of the people, as just or unjust, is known. So it makes sense to have that clear there. In fiction, going a little bit beyond what you asked, it is like life that we are confronted with things we cannot know completely. And we have to figure out, is this good or bad? A lot of the puzzle in the book Nemesis is Miss Marple wondering, is this person a friend or a foe? Is this a person who is upset because there's some secret guilt or because there's something else going on in the person's life? And that's like life. Partly that's the verisimilitude is interesting to us, and also the intellectual puzzle of it is interesting. That makes it more complex. It requires more thought, more balancing of possibilities for us to figure out what may or may not be true and to arrive at the conclusion. It's a more sophisticated intellectual problem, in other words. I wasn't quite sure how you got from that to Murder on the Orient Express, where we know about, once we know that Ratchet is evil, that's sufficient?
Right. At least Poirot seems satisfied.
And I think partly it's because I'm thinking about justice with the whole range of meanings. And Pierre Michel, the conductor of the Wagon Lee car, I think it hurt him to be involved in that. Just the things in the book, at one point he buries his face in his hands. It's not clear, is this the horror at what happened to his wife and his daughter? Or has what he has just done also damaged him? That's part of the problem. We can't know, we don't know exactly what's going on. But does an avenger is making moral choices? Well, in some ways it would be like the decision to try to assassinate Hitler when he was in power. But there, that could be considered an act of war if you were American or English or Italian or French. Whereas here, the people aren't soldiers, they're choosing this. It's the effect on them of what they have done. And that's unknowable. And balancing is the fact that what would be the effect on them to know the identity of this evil person and not avenge?
Doesn't Poirot say there somewhere that it's the ones who get away with it that interest me most?
Oh. Yeah. Well, it's a difficult moral problem, but awfully risky. And I like Miss Marple's simplicity here. That it's silly to get caught up in thinking that a noble ideal will justify evil.
You had
Yes.
several definitions of piety, the Greek made, as being justice, being served, and stuff like that. In the case of Poirot and Orient Express, he knows who the criminals are, he doesn't report. Several Conan Doyle's short stories also, Sherlock Holmes discovers the murderer or the one in the revengeful killing and doesn't report it to the authorities. Would you consider them pious? Or just taking the law into their own hands and not turning them over to the justice system?
Yeah, I think that would strain the possibility of whether they're pious. I don't think either of those characters would welcome that adjective. They're neither of them
Would your
overtly
definition of
religious
pious
men.
fit, though? I mean, they've taken, that justice has been served, apparently in their minds.
And they would take justice in the sense,
Pious was to serve justice, so.
well, but in the fullest sense, it involves right relation to God. And if you're not concerned about that, and I think those two characters aren't.
Well, I think even in the movie version of Orient Express, as Poirot's walking off the train, he's mentioned in his own breath as saying, "May God have mercy on my soul." I think he said something.
Oh, now that, I just
It's in the
watched it over
PBS
again.
version. I don't
He
think
says,
it's in the
"I must
original."
wrestle with my conscience now."
Yeah.
And that's in the film version, and it's not in the book.
No, it's not in the book, and I don't think it's in the movie version. I think it's in the PBS series version.
Okay, I've heard that in the 2010 new version made with David Suchet as Poirot,
Right.
and I've not seen that, that they've made a few changes along the way, and one of them is that Poirot is visibly uneasy.
Walking away from the train, he's saying he's a Catholic, he's saying the rosary, and he says,
Ah.
"God have mercy on my soul." So does that still fit in the definition of pious?
I think it does. I think it does. I think he's, especially if, in the course of the narrative in the new version with David Suchet, they have it be that he suggests his two ways of solving the crime and does not make the decision himself. If it's the head of the Wagon Lee who chooses which thing to take, then Poirot has not served as judge. And I think that would be an important area of leniency for him. What do you think?
He even scolds the perpetrators before he walks off the train, saying that they took justice into their own hands, and kind of scolds him. But then he walks off the train and he's saying his rosary, mumbling that he's a Catholic and for God to have mercy on his soul. So
Very interesting.
My whole thing is, well, with that, and in Conan Doyle, now Sherlock Holmes doesn't have that. He doesn't have that religious aspect. He just thinks, well, this guy had a pretty good revengeful act, and he was satisfied with it. He found out who the perpetrator was, and the police didn't, but he thought the guy had a good reason for doing what he did, and just leaves it at that. But in Suchet and the Orient Express, the PBS version, he's really he's torn between what he had just done, and he walks by the policeman and says, you've got a murderer, but nobody knows how it happened.
Ah.
But he's wrestling with himself. He's in tears. Which is really amazing for Poirot, to be in that situation. But I would just think it in terms of your definition of pious, beginning with Solomon and the others, if that fits that definition of being pious.
The phrase conflicted pious comes to mind. I think that would fit it. Interesting question.
It's probably also worth mentioning again, as you already have, that Lord Peter Wimsey submits the people he catches to legal justice, and then he still suffers.
Yes, he does. And he also, once he's submitted them to legal justice, as often as he can, is engaged in seeking legal defense for them to protect themselves, if possible, from being punished. He himself calls the horrid states he gets into the responsibility dream. He feels responsible for everyone and everything, and I'm putting words in his mouth right there. But he's also not a deeply Christian person. And there's one scene in one of the novels, and I can't remember which one it is, in which he's been speaking with the curate exactly about, do I have any right to expose somebody to legal justice? It's not even my job. I'm not paid to do this. I just enjoy solving mysteries, and here I am, this person would not be known to be a criminal, and look what I've done. And the vicar afterwards is saying to himself, these intellectuals with shallow faith are just so fragile. I must remember to pray for him. Is it? Is it? Thank you.
Well, for Lord Peter Wimsey, of course, he lives in a time when murderers are hanged. And
Yes.
it gets tied up with his experience in the war because he was in command of an infantry unit. And thus it was his job to send men out to be killed, in part. And he knew that certain numbers of his soldiers under his command would die in combat, and they did. And hence the responsibility train, which then gets bound up with all this activity of his solving murders, because somebody is going to die, namely the murderer.
And it doesn't even help him. It does intellectually, but it doesn't affect his feelings, that he often recognizes he has prevented other murders.
Yes.
And that's very clear in Busman's Honeymoon,
Yes.
where he realizes that if the murderer had not been caught, he knows exactly who the next victim would have been. And that woman is alive because the murderer was caught for the first crime. But that doesn't spare him the agony.
That particular story fits part of your thesis very well, though, because the crucial turning point in the story is what happens between Lord Peter and Harriet Vane. And the fact that where very often what he would do the night before the hanging is get in his car and go driving off madly into the distance. Instead, he comes home to Harriet and tells her about it and expresses his feelings and his sense of anguish over what is about to take place. So here's a wonderful instance of what you were describing earlier in terms of the healing of the community. And he acknowledges that if he did not do that, their marriage would not survive the consequences.
And earlier, when it had seemed for a moment that his bride's distaste, her distasteful reaction to the fact that he was involved in possibly prosecuting, this time they thought she thought a different person was guilty. She didn't want that to be, she didn't want somebody she knew and liked to be brought into the dock, and he's realizing he now has two responsibilities. He's a spouse, but he's got sort of a vocation to solve crimes and what's going to give. And she sees that and she immediately backs off, because it's not going to be the marriage that gives. He's got to go through with what he is able to do and meant to do. Interestingly, that shows how the seeking justice generally also is beneficial to the wholeness of the individual and even the gradual healing of the individual. Peter Wimsey himself is getting stronger and more whole through these experiences. Yeah.
Well, if there are no more questions, please join me again in thanking Dr. Tkacz. And there are more events coming up tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock in Junt Auditorium. Dr. Dan McInerney will be speaking. The topic or title of his talk is Sucking the Life. It's in what?
Jepson.
Oh, it's this one. Yeah, okay. Sorry. Sucking the Life from Our Children, Hollywood and the Romance of the Living Dead. And then he will be speaking again tomorrow night at 7 out at Whitworth in the Robinson Teaching Theater. And then on Friday evening in this room, Dr. Mike Foley will address the topic, the mystery, Christian error, or nemesis. So we have more than one theme emerging here. So thank you for coming tonight. I hope to see you at the other events as well.